Outside of that, yeah, as soon as the event was over, the scary part's the 5 days after the freeze. Those fish stay on the bottom multiple days. I mean, it's basically it's a refrigerator at that point. The water temps are
Right.
It's 30 to 45 degrees. Those fish are just basically frozen on the bottom for 4 or 5 days straight, and then about the end of the fourth and fifth day is when you start to see those tails kick up and they start to float.
And then they wash to what we see. Okay.
The day at Grand Bay, those fish were just starting to float that day, because it really, I'll be honest, it seemed like as we were going by and picking fish up, we would turn around, there'd be a fish right behind us. So we still picked up 2 larger 24-inch trout off the bottom. But that was kind of the pattern we saw. So that we saw a lot of dead mullet across the board, across the entire state. And we saw limited impacts to the other species. And when we did see impacts, the most concerning one was the amount of large trout that were in there.
Yeah. That's your breeders.
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess outside of that particular point, that all of that life or loss of life does stay within the ecosystem, right? I mean, I'm sure all the birds and
you're
the
gonna see an influx in crabs and seagulls.
They're happy about
those raccoons
it.
are doing real good.
I mean, that's
the
like
fattest raccoon you ever seen in your
like
life.
Thanksgiving for them. You know, like, man, what is this? This is great.
Yeah. And just as, in a general principle, right? Fisheries removals themselves, we're supposed to stay within some level of compensatory mortality. So mortality that would already occur to the stock, regardless of whether we were there or not.
Right.
Density dependent functions and everything else. And with this kind of instance, right, you try to do your best to scale it and figure out what's going on. And as we went through, you could see that the bulk of the fishery, the largest magnitude of the fishery, was relatively unscathed across the board. And we did have focused level impacts on those areas that were mentioned. But for the most part, that's kind of what we saw. So it was good news and bad news at the same time. And we are, looking to monitor throughout the next 2 years. One thing we really want to focus on is, one, recruitment. So are we seeing young of the year trout regularly in our fishery independent sampling? And 2, what do the year classes look like upcoming? So do we see any impact? What size of the year classes? Because up until now, that's another thing I briefed the commission on this morning, was basically spotted sea trout and, where we were and everything else like that. And we've been basically pushing forward with index-based management the best we can with that species, due to what we talked about in the first time I was on here, which is the whole MRIP, MS Krill recreational estimates thing. We're basically going down and trying to monitor based on the index. And by all accounts, we were hitting a little bit of a inflection point toward positivity from 23 into 24. And, for all those that have been on the water and recognize it, essentially ever since 2017, we've had negative rainfall impacts.
Oh, yeah.
And freshwater impacts every 2 years. So 17, we had
knock on wood.
22 inches of rain alone in the month of June in 2017. 2019 was Monte Carlo spillway. Of course, we all are familiar with that. 2021 was record rainfall in the area. And then it wasn't until the last really 3 years where we saw actually a positive environment. Salinity ranges all the way back on the marsh, which increases your spawning habitat and likely has a positive impact on successful recruitment. So